Welcome to the latest installment in our Meet the Meforshim Series. Over the last several weeks, we have considered the life and times and contribution of some of the greatest personalities of the last 1,000 years. And tonight we're going to discuss possibly the greatest, probably the most well-known, and that is the Rambam, Rabbi Moshe ben Maimon, known worldwide as Maimonides. And as we shall see, his influence on Jewish life in his own day, subsequently, and until our own times is probably unsurpassed. Just to mention that, as in the past, this lesson is dedicated to the memory of Mordechai ben Harav Menachem Mendel and Liba Bas Abba, and also Shmuel ben David, the parents and the father-in-law of David Barry, who's been with us over the last several weeks. I hope you have the source material that we've handed out, and exceptionally, compared to the previous weeks, we have 4 sides of text here, and we'll see how much of it we can get through. You can see even the first page, which has the very brief biographical sketch of our subject of Rambam, is also more extensive than the skeleton that we've worked with in some of the other personalities whose lives we have considered. So, the Rambam was born in Cordova, in Spain, in Andalusia, southern Spain, in 1135, on the 14th of Nisan, Erev Pesach. His date of birth is normally, regarded as you have here in 1135, but there is some evidence he was actually born in 1138. And I'm only mentioning that because if so, the accomplishments that he has to his credit on his CV are all the more extraordinary because he would have actually been 3 years younger than is generally regarded. There is some evidence to support that view, but we don't need to dwell on it because fundamentally it doesn't make that much of a difference. He died in Cairo, in Fostat, Old Cairo in Egypt in 1204. On the 12th of December, some sources think he died in 1205 because of the Hebrew date, meaning the Hebrew date was already the following year in the Hebrew calendar, but it was the end of the civil year. So again, just a little detail. He's popularly known as Rambam, Rabbi Moshe ben Maimon, and he is remembered as a halachist. It says here commentator. He was not a Torah commentator in the sense that he wrote a perush on the Chumash. So in that sense, our Meet the Meforshim designation is slightly imprecise. But he was a commentator on the Mishnah, and we'll discuss that when we get there very soon. And of course, he was a very great philosopher, and his contribution to world philosophy is, again, profound and very widely recognized. Please take your hand up. It's probably true to say that the Rambam is the dominant Jewish intellectual personality, the dominant figure in Jewish intellectual history in the post-Talmudic age. He was the greatest in halacha, he was the greatest in philosophy, and there is a question about his familiarity with Kabbalah. I would suggest that he did not know about Kabbalah. If he did know about it, he didn't necessarily impute great credibility to it. The Rambam, of course, was a rationalist, and therefore the Kabbalistic tradition probably did not interest him. The best one can say, or the most sympathetic one can say, is that he simply wasn't aware of it. It was an esoteric doctrine, and he possibly was not exposed to it. That hasn't stopped the Chabad people from publishing a book called Mar Makomos, the Sefer Mishnah Torah. This thick book, it must have about 500 pages, 850 pages, consists of the sources of the Mishnah Torah. We'll discuss later on why there could be the need for such a book, and it is a useful book. But they have suggested a source for some of the laws of the Rambam in the Mishnah Torah in the Kabbalistic literature, in the Zohar, and some of the other Kabbalistic literature, Sefer Yetzirah, Sefer Bahir. It's very speculative as to whether the Rambam was familiar with those works, whether he drew upon them, and whether they influenced his halachic writings. Very doubtful, in my opinion.
Can I just say,
Yeah.
There was an edict that until a certain period of time, supposedly the Chokhmat and Istar and things like that would be kept hidden from the public, and the Gedolim or the generation.
Yeah.
So maybe they knew it, but they didn't express it in public.
That's probably true. I would agree with that. But to think that the Rambam was not among those great people who was initiated into the secrets of the Kabbalah would be surprising, because even in his lifetime, as we shall see, he was acknowledged as a towering intellectual figure, an expert in all areas of Torah. So if he had an opportunity to learn it, it's unlikely that people would have said, Rambam, don't tell him about it, keep it to yourself, don't reveal it to someone like the Rambam. He's just a regular guy, it's only for the elite. It's unlikely. But what could be is that he simply literally did not come into contact with someone who had access to it. So we'll leave that as an open question.
Well, I mean, if you read his writings, he's very rationalistic and completely dismissive
Yes.
of things which many of the Kabbalistic tradition treat much more seriously than he does. He's
Yeah.
very dismissive and
Yes.
calls it, quite insulting.
Yes.
These things. So,
Yes.
so if that is the case, why would he be saying all these things which are very dismissive? It doesn't quite tally the argument. He's a proto-Kabbalist, which is often used.
Yeah, I would tend to agree. Okay, we may have a chance to touch on that as we go along. Okay, in about the year 1170, so we'll make use of the biographical sketch that you have in front of you, and we'll elaborate on it as we go along. In about 1170, Rambam began to write his monumental Mishnah Torah, a compendium of all Jewish laws extracted from the Talmud and the works of the Gaonim. The work consists of 14 volumes and is also called Yad HaChazakah, the strong arm or hand. The word Yad in Hebrew, of course, is Yud Daled, which is 14 because it was comprised of 14 books, the 14 volumes of his work. For short, it is often referred to as Yad or simply the Rambam. Now, there is much that lies beneath. You can see possibly behind me, I've filled the whole shulchan here with some selections from my library. There are a lot more volumes as well. I thought this is enough, though, to represent what I want to show you. I just started looking on my shelves, and I was taking down so many volumes that are pertinent to the Rambam, most remarkable. I'm not saying my library is remarkable. It's remarkable to what extent the Rambam's impact on Jewish life today continues to reverberate. By the way, I can't resist observing that in many circles, every bar mitzvah boy will acquire or receive as a gift a set of the Rambam. We have it here on the shelf. I'm a bit on a short leash today, but this set of volumes, I think it's 8 volumes, and it comes in large and small. This is a large set of Mishnah Torah, which I bought years ago, although this smaller set in some ways is better, which I'll get to in a moment as well, but I keep interrupting myself. What I want to tell you is that it's extraordinary to consider that St. Thomas Aquinas, Lahavdil, lived about a couple of generations after the Rambam. And he was also a great philosopher. I don't mean to compare them. I'm only mentioning him because in Christian history, he's one of the great thinkers, one of the great philosophical, Gedolim of Christian theology. And his writings are very influential. And yet today, how many sets of the writings of St. Thomas Aquinas are purchased in the original Latin? I mean, do you think the number extends into the thousands? Probably more like dozens. Even that, I'm not sure. I mean, maybe an academic library would acquire it. If you start a university and you want to stock your library, you may buy one. In the original Latin, maybe, I'm not even sure. And the Rambam's writings, the Mishnah Torah, is published in the original Hebrew and studied every day of the year around the world. And as I say, every bar mitzvah boy in many circles will acquire a set of the Rambam in the original Hebrew. This is something most remarkable, I think, which reflects not only the esteem of the Rambam per se, but the way that the Jewish community, we as a nation, value and appreciate and have acquired facility with studying and appreciating the teachings and the writings of great people in the original Hebrew, the ancient language of the Torah. So, no, Mishnah Torah is halachic. Mishnah is halachic, and this is the first volume of the Mishnah Torah. It consists of 14 books. It's not necessarily published in 14 volumes, but it consists of 14 books. Now, the reason I belabor the point is that it's often called the Yad HaChazakah. And the reason it's called the Yad HaChazakah is at the end of the introduction of the Rambam, he alludes to that expression, L'chol hayad hachazaka asher asa Moshe le'inei kol Yisrael, the strong hand that Moshe performed in the eyes of all of Israel. Of course, this is a pun. His name is Moshe, Moshe ben Maimon. So he was likening himself to Moshe Rabbeinu. But that wasn't all of it, because he actually gave his book the name Mishneh Torah, which means a second Torah, or a companion to the Torah. Either way, it's a kind of bold designation. Not only that, but he writes in his introduction, I'm calling this book the Mishneh Torah, Lefisha Adam Korei Torah Shebiksav Tchila. He reads the written Torah first. We've got the Aron Kodesh right over here. V'achar kach Korei Bezeh, and after that he reads my book. V'yodeh mimeno Torah Shebal Peh Kula, and that way he'll know all of the oral Torah. Ve'enot tzarech likros sefer acher beinehem. He doesn't need any other books. Now, wasn't there another important book called the Talmud? The Rambam seems to say you don't need the Talmud anymore. So it was a very bold move, and that is why it's often called the Yad, because people don't want to call it Mishneh Torah, because it actually suggests the, as I said, the high self-regard of the Rambam in calling his book by that name, Mishneh Torah, a second Torah. And he does not include the sources for all of the halachos, and as we'll see in one moment, his book is comprehensive. The Mishneh Torah covers all of the laws in the Torah, all the Taryag mitzvahs, 613 commandments, all of the rabbinic laws which are associated with them, the application and the elaboration down to the practical details. He has a siddur here. He tells you what to pray. He's got it written out in full. It is an extraordinarily comprehensive work, the likes of which had never been attempted before and has never been surpassed either. So by calling his book Mishneh Torah, his critics say he's trying to supplant the Torah Shebal Peh. He's trying to supplant the Talmud and also trying to close off any argument, because he says, don't read anything else. All you need is me. And because he doesn't cite his sources, it makes it more difficult for the student to critique it, to assess it, to say, well, does the Talmud really say this or say something different? Is he following the dominant, accepted view, or maybe he's plucked out a minority view? Or sometimes the Rambam seems to follow a view which is not even found in the Talmud Bavli at all. You've got to search in the Talmud Yerushalmi to find it, which I don't have time to go into what the Talmud Yerushalmi even is. But this has piqued not just curiosity, but has aroused the ire of many of his contemporaries, and one important contemporary in particular. What do you say, Daniel?
Well, I was going to say on this point, because that's extremely, it goes against all forms of tradition, have not quoting sources.
Yes.
And say he was rejected by many of his contemporaries.
Yes.
But it's amazing today how, in spite of that, it's accepted almost.
Absolutely.
And yet that goes against everything.
You're right. That's why I say it was only the extraordinary, not just the personality, but the stature of the Rambam. Now, his most famous critic is called the Ravid, Rabbi Avram ben David. He lived in Spain, and he he was older than the Rambam, and he was already renowned when the Rambam was a young upstart. Look at the dates again. The Rambam began this in 1170. He was only born in 1135, maybe later. So he was about 35 years old when he began. Okay, he took him a few years to finish, but he was a relatively young man when he undertook this enormously ambitious project. The Ravid was probably 30 years older at that time. When he saw what this young scholar from Egypt had written, he got hold of a copy, picked up his pen, and when he saw something he didn't like, he wrote in the margin, I disagree. Sometimes he expresses himself in very strong language as well. These are known as the Hasagos HaRavid, the criticism of the Ravid, and every classic printing of the Rambam, which there have been dozens and dozens over the years, will always include the Hasagos HaRavid. And at this point, I must tell you that 35 years ago, I bought this volume in the Shuk HaPishpishim in Yafo, the Yafo flea market. It was nestled among Harlequin romances and that sort of thing, and I paid for it, doesn't say, not very much though. And I bought it because it looked like an antiquarian book, and it's not in the best of shape, as you see. I'll pass it around. But what is extraordinary about this printing of the Mishneh Torah is it does not have the Hasagos HaRavid. It does not have the animate versions of the Ravid, which is very, very rare. Of all the printings of the Rambam, there have only been 2 or 3 without it. It was printed in Venice in 1700. Unfortunately, it does not have the Scharblatt. It does not have the title page. Otherwise, it would be quite valuable. Instead, it has several pages written by hand, evidently in Yemen. This book was printed in Venice in 1700, and it ended up in Yemen, where probably it was already in tatters at that time, and someone actually wrote by hand, very beautiful, beautiful handwriting, I'll pass it around, to add in the first few pages, and at the end as well, a few pages that were torn at the end were missing, and in between you have the printing, and it's very interesting. It's without the criticisms of the Ravid. There are some marginal notes here as well. The fascinating thing is that this was probably intended for teaching whether children or adults or scholars. It was a kind of Kitzur Shulchan Aruch of its time, because this printing is one volume that has only selected parts of the Mishnah Torah. The Rambam Mishnah Torah covers all the 613 commandments, including the laws of the Messiah, including the laws of building the third temple, including all the laws of the sacrifices, including all the laws of ritual purity and impurity, which have not been part of Jewish practice for 1,000 years already in his time. By our days, it's almost close to 2,000 years. They're all here. So this volume that I'm holding contains the chapters which are most important for practical day-to-day living. And it was evidently published in that form, as I say, just selection. So pass this around. It's an interesting volume. I took it to an expert at the Hebrew University Library, the National Library, to show it to him, and he gave me some pointers as to what its origin may have been, etc. Since there's no title page, it wasn't easy to identify when and where it was printed, but we managed to work it out, 1700 in Venice. This is the sort of classic printing of the Rambam, and as you can see, it's quite large and maybe not as well used as it maybe should be, ideally, but I have made use of it quite a lot over the years. Now, it also has the Sefer HaMitzvos. The Rambam decided that I'm going to compile a comprehensive halachic compendium of all the laws in the Torah. I want to be sure I don't leave any out. So the first thing I need to do is to compile a list of what are the 613 commandments. The Talmud says there are 613 commandments. As we know, 365 negative commandments and 248 positive commandments. But the Talmud does not tell us what they are. And the Torah itself certainly does not spell them out, although the Torah contains them. Excuse me. So the Rambam made up a list of the 613 commandments. It's not just a list, though. It's a book unto itself. And that is the checklist which ensures that his extended work will address each one of those 613 commandments. I'll pass this around as well. And this one is the new standard Mishnah Torah, which is published by the Shabtai Frankel. I don't think he's living any longer, but over the course of many years, this particular scholar, Shabtai Frankel, was a publisher but a scholar as well in his own right, did a lot of research with manuscripts and early printings to produce a very beautiful, precise, and uncensored edition of the Rambam. Why do I say uncensored? Because there's a famous passage, there are a number of passages, but there's one famous passage which was censored by the church, in which the Rambam refers to the coming of Messiah, and he refers to the some of the other religions that have come on the scene and have distorted the words of the Torah. He refers to Jesus and he refers to Muhammad, not in the most complimentary terms, and that's probably why it was excerpted or really excised. But you'll find it here in the Frankel edition of the Rambam as well. Just pass that around as well for those who like to see.
Did you write the list? Oh, you wrote the list first.
Yes. Yeah, and he writes that because I want to write the Mishnah Torah, I realize I need to write the list first. So he first compiled the list to ensure. But the comprehensive breadth of it, as I say, is without precedent, has not been equaled ever since either. A most remarkable achievement. Yeah.
Right. This critique of other religions, is it most volumes not contained? Or?
Most printings do not have it. When this was published, this a Maimonides reader was published about probably 50 years ago by Isidore Twersky. So he does include it, but he says this published in 1972. So he does include that passage, and I think he indicates the printing, which was maybe in Rome in the 1500s, that he had to consult in order to find the uncensored version. For hundreds of years it was only available, it was only censored, but now in this Frankel Rambam it has been reinstated. If you want to know what that passage is, by the way, I think I've got it here. I will just see.
Which volume is it?
It's in the last section. It's in the 14th book. It's in the laws of the kings and their wars. The following is the uncensored version at the end of Kings chapter 11. And he refers to Jesus of Nazareth, and he refers to Muhammad as well. And all these matters related to Jesus of Nazareth and the Ishmaelite, Muhammad, who came after him, only served to clear the way for King Messiah, to prepare the whole world to worship God with one accord. Okay, etc. If you want to take a look here, it's on page 226. It's a very useful book, this one. It's another one from my student years. You can see it has suffered with wear and tear. It's Maimonides reader, very useful compendium. Excuse me?
What page is it?
226, is it? 226, you can take a look, yeah. Published by Isidore Twersky, by the way. Isidore Twersky was the head of Jewish studies at Harvard University for many years. He was a son-in-law of Rabbi Joseph Soloveitchik, the great Rabbi Rashi Soloveitchik. He was his son-in-law. He was also a Hasidic Rebbe. Most remarkable combination, actually, being the head of chairman of the Jewish Studies Department at Harvard and also Hasidic rabbi. Remarkable combination. I'll pass this around as well. This is what I mentioned. The Chabad people have published this useful book, and every halach of the Rambam they have sources for. The sources have been already not just suggested but identified long before, but these are much more comprehensive. But I said it also ranges quite into the speculative as well. I'll just pass that around.
Rabbi,
Yeah.
are you aware of any overarching principles for why when the Ravid attacks the Rambam?
Well, the Ravid does not agree with all of the rationalism of the Rambam, because although this is a halachic work, the Mishnah Torah, actually, let's take a look at the second page. It's on the reverse of your first page. There you have the 14 books of the Mishnah Torah. It's worth looking at now. We pick up on the biographical sketch soon. But here you have the 14 books of the Mishnah Torah, and you can see the contents of each of the books. So the first one, for example, Sefer Hamada, the book of knowledge, is very philosophical. There's a lot of philosophy in it. The very first section, the book of principles of the Torah. Actually, pass that to. I'm sorry, Esther. Yesodei HaTorah is all philosophy. Basic principle of the Torah is all philosophy. The second one, Hilchos Deos, ethical and moral conduct. Also, a lot of philosophy, somewhat we would call Musar. Also, medical advice. Then you've got the study of the Torah, idolatry, repentance. So the laws of tshuva are very widely studied, especially during Elul until the days of Yom Kippur. Very, very important. The next section, Sefer Ahava, also has some philosophy in it. And in fact, there is philosophy that is woven into the whole of the Mishnah Torah. Even though it's halachic work, but there are some references, as I say, some passages which are entirely philosophical. But even in the sort of regular halachic work passages, there's a lot of philosophy in there as well. Isidore Twersky actually wrote an article, I have it in my collection here, on some non-halachic aspects of the Mishnah Torah, in which he details many such examples. Actually, since I'm mentioning Twersky, this is one of probably his magnum opus, Isidore Twersky, Introduction to the Code of Maimonides. Now this, my friends, is 630 pages of small print with a lot of footnotes, and this is an introduction to the Code of Maimonides. It's a work of fantastic scholarship on the part of Dr. Twersky. By the way, a distant cousin to the other Shia Twersky that we quote sometimes, the psychiatrist who wrote all the books. They are related, but they're distant cousins. They're not closely related. Isidore Tursky is with a Y, and Dr. Abraham Tursky is with an I. But they are related, but only distantly. They're frequently confused, of course, with one another. So the Ravid, doesn't like the philosophy of the Rambam. Sometimes the Rambam will, as I said before, appear to follow the wrong opinion in the Talmud, or he'll follow a view which is not even found in the Talmud. I'll give you one famous example. The Rambam writes in Mishnah Torah that a ger, a proselyte, who owns a piece of land in the land of Israel, and he has first fruits. So he harvests the fruits and he takes it to Jerusalem, like everyone does, and he is supposed to make a declaration. The farmer is supposed to make a declaration, and the declaration he makes says that refers to the fact that our ancestors were enslaved in Egypt, and Hashem, you redeemed us, you brought us to this land, and this is the first fruits of the land, and I'm bringing it here to the temple. So the Talmud says, Ger mevi ve'eno kore. He brings, but he doesn't make the declaration, because he cannot say that my ancestors were enslaved in Egypt and all of that, because they weren't tzedek in Egypt. Maybe his ancestors were living in some other part of the world in freedom. And he became a ger tzedek, and he bought a piece of land, and the land belongs to him, and he's a faithful Jew, but he can't make that declaration because it doesn't actually reflect the reality. That's what the Talmud says. The Rambam says ger mevi v'koreh. He does make the declaration, because he is considered to be a descendant of Abraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov, and therefore he can make that declaration, and he can also pray to refer to God of our fathers, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Now, the interesting thing is, it may seem to us very pleasing, but what's the source for it? How does the Rambam come up with such an opinion? How does he support an opinion when the Talmud says the opposite? The answer is, it's in the Talmud Yerushalmi. The Rambam chooses to follow an opinion in the Talmud Yerushalmi against the Talmud Bavli. So not everybody is sort of content with that kind of very individualistic choice. I don't know if the Ravid criticizes that particular comment of the Rambam. The Rambam is very independent, and the Ravid often takes issue with that. And again,
would that be because, Rabbi, that the Rambam and the Yerushalmi interpret the verse as being one's spiritual ancestors?
You could say, but I'm interested more in the technical, self-confidence on the part of the Rambam to follow a view in the Yerushalmi over the view in the Mishnah. It's not just in the Talmud; it's in the Mishnah. It's in the Mishnah itself. Okay.
But
Yeah.
this is another point, though, isn't it? Because he's going against the traditional works of the two Talmuds. The Bavli
Is more authoritative.
So
That's
for him
right.
To go against it, you can see. I mean, from our eyes looking back, we're saying well, he's a great man, but in the times of the contemporaries,
Absolutely.
was he to
Chutzpah,
choose
that's
this
right.
on what basis, is he?
That's right. The Rambam, you could say, although we find his remarkable humility in many places, but at the same time, he was not short of chutzpah or self-belief. That's for sure. That's for sure. Just see, was it? Oh yeah, this is another Mishnah Torah. This I actually did get from my bar mitzvah. I didn't get the whole set from my bar mitzvah. I wasn't on that madrega. I had to buy one later on when I went to yeshiva. But this I did get from my bar mitzvah. And this is the Mishnah Torah Hebrew English Abridged edition. And of course, it's naturally only selections from the Mishnah Torah, but has a lot of fascinating material. The selections are fascinating with an English translation as well. Very useful book, actually. I still use it sometimes. Well, it's been a bit now obsolete because of the technology, but for a long time when I was using the Rambam in a shiur, I would make use of this book for photocopying because it has Hebrew and English. Okay, let's go back now. It was completed in 1180 and written in a lucid and concise Mishnaic Hebrew. Now, this is important because the other writings of the Rambam, and he wrote widely, were all written in Arabic, Judeo-Arabic. That is to say, like a Jewish dialect of Arabic, written in Hebrew characters, but Arabic language, as I say, known as Judeo-Arabic. The Rambam wrote all of his writings in that Judeo-Arabic dialect. The Mishnah Torah was unique among his writings in that he wrote it in a Mishnaic Hebrew, lucid, compelling. most legal tomes by their nature are technical, are not fascinating, are not, arresting. They're turgid, they're technical, they're sometimes, verbose for reasons of comprehensiveness. The Rambam had that gift of clarity and simplicity. And when you read it in Hebrew, which, as I say, the Hebrew is a very lucid Hebrew, not a difficult, technical Hebrew, or in English, you can see it has that a very attractive quality. And we actually see a couple of examples of that. Hopefully we'll get to that shortly.
How many volumes is this?
That's one volume. That's just one volume. Yeah, it's only short excerpts. Yeah. Just see if there's anything else to pass around at this point yet. No. Okay. For this reason, by the way, the Mishnah Torah was immediately accessible to students of Torah all over the world, whereas his other writings were of more limited and kind of uneven impact in the rest of the Jewish world, because in Ashkenaz and even in Provence, they didn't speak Arabic, and they needed to have it translated. We'll talk more about that shortly. Okay, let's go on. It was the first comprehensive codification of all Torah laws. It includes both the laws of immediate relevance, such as the laws of Shabbat and family purity, and those pertaining to the Messianic age, such as laws of the temple service and sacrifices. Yet the Mishnah Torah is not a dry legalistic book of statutes and ordinances. Its rulings are interspersed with ethical insights and philosophical teachings that infuse it with vitality and spirituality. Vast in scope, it has never been equaled by any other work. Rambam has omitted mentioning his sources. This has become the subject of numerous commentaries that attempt to identify the references on which Rambam's rulings are based. Hundreds of thousands of Jews throughout the world daily study one or more chapters of the Talmud, and we've already mentioned that book from Chabad that fills in a lot of the sources. Some are a bit speculative, again, as we've mentioned. The enterprise of explaining the Rambam, of analyzing a page of the Talmud and studying it deeply, starting with the commentary of Rashi, and then going to the Tosafos, and then considering the other commentaries like the Ramban, Nachmanides, or Rashba, or others. This is the way that we study Talmud classically for many hundreds of years. And then, after understanding it to the best of our ability, and I don't just mean our ability like myself as a student, but even a great Rosh Yeshiva, he will then say, with all of this in mind, how can we understand the Rambam? Because the Rambam, having analyzed the subject so thoroughly, we find the Rambam says something completely different, and he seems to be out of step with the other commentaries. And therefore, so much intellectual ingenuity is devoted to explaining what was the view of the Rambam. But the Rambam's language is so precise, and his choice of words is so well chosen. And the idea that the Rambam overlooked a passage in the Talmud is unthinkable. And therefore, enormous intellectual effort and ingenuity and brilliance is devoted to explaining what did the Rambam mean. And very often we find that the Rambam is consistent in what he says in one passage and in a different passage. And he is a personality of such towering importance that countless hours of Talmudic study are invested in explaining a passage or even a word, a choice of words of the Rambam. There's a famous joke of a brisker who goes to Shamayim after 120 years, and he's looking forward to meeting the Rambam. And so he does, and he says, Rambam, I've spent so many years of my life delving into your teachings and into your writings, and often we've been struggling to understand what you've written and how we can explain it, how we can reconcile it. And can you tell me this particular passage you've written like this, and I just can't work it out. What does it mean? How is it consistent with what Talmud says in this location and another location? So the Rambam takes it, he said, yeah, let me take a look. Oh no, this is a scribal error. It's supposed to say something different. So the brisker says, Azai for Rambam. That's how you resolve a problem in the Rambam, by saying it's a scribal error. But the brisker tradition and many, many others, as I say, have devoted enormous energy and intellectual ingenuity into explaining the Rambam. And it's not just an exercise in intellectual gymnastics, because, as I say, the Rambam's writings, I'm talking about the Mishnah Torah, are all practical. I mean, some of them are not let's say, applicable to my life today, right now in Golders Green. But it is intended as a practical compendium for how we lead our lives. So the writings of the Rambam in that regard are very important, and inevitably one is astounded by the profundity of the Rambam and his grasp of the Torah literature. Continue on the next column. Rambam received his first Torah instruction from his father, a noted scholar who traced his ancestry back to Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi, compiler of the Mishnah, and to King David. If you remember, for those who were here, the same was true for Rashi. Rashi also traced his lineage back to Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi through Rabbi Yochanan HaSandler.
Isn't halacha, the ultimate halacha, based on one of three, the Rif, the Rambam, and the
Rosh? That is what the Beis Yosef writes. Yeah, Rav Yosef Karo, the author of Shulchan Aruch, writes in his Beis Yosef that he is going to decide the halacha in accordance with the majority of those three opinions: the Rif, the Rambam, and the Rosh. The Rif was Rav Yitzchak Alfasi. Yaakov and I went to his town, Fez, and we learned a lot about him there. The Rif was lived before the Rambam. The Rif died in 1103. And 1103 or 1113, I forget which one, but he lived before the Rambam. But the Rif was the mentor of the Ri Migash, Rav Yosef ibn Migash. Ri Migash was the Rebbe of the Rambam's father. So the Rambam praises Ri Migash very, very highly because he was the Rebbe of the Rambam's own father. And the Rambam's father was the Av Bet Din in Cordova. So the Rambam can, and by the way, he in some places traces his own lineage back 7 or 8 or 10 generations. He was descended from a long line of rabbinic scholars, but it goes without saying the Rambam himself far surpasses those who came before him and his descendants as well, some of whom were also distinguished, but of course nothing like the grandeur of the Rambam himself. When he was 13, Cordova was conquered by the invading Almohades, a fanatical Muslim sect. We have had occasion to mention them in the past in our series as well. The family were forced to flee, wandering from place to place for 12 years, ultimately settling in Fez, Morocco. So they wandered throughout Andalusia, and then finally they ended up in Fez for a number of years. We don't know exactly how long they were in Fez, but for several years. The Fez tour guides will tell you that the Rambam taught in the madrasa there in Fez, and Yaakov and I were there to see it. We didn't see the Rambam there, but we did see where he supposedly taught, and we also saw his home, supposedly his home of the Rambam, where you can buy cheap non-kosher Chinese takeaway if you want as well. But anyway, we were there, yeah. So Cordova was conquered. The family was forced to flee, wandering from place to place for 12 years, ultimately settling in Fez. Yeah. In 1165, Rambam settled in Cairo. Now, the interesting thing is that from Fez, where life was very difficult for Jews as well, it's ironic. The Almohades, we said, were these fundamentalist, very intolerant, violent Muslim marauders who streamed across the Straits of Gibraltar into Spain, and they spread a totally intolerant form of Islam by the edge of the sword. And it was very difficult for Jews, and they fled. The Rambam and his family, he was only 13, 14 years old, but the family fled. But they fled from Spain to North Africa, to Morocco. It's a bit like, running from the wolf into the jaws of the lion, because the Almohades, their base was in Morocco, and they fled to Morocco. So it wasn't easy there. There is some evidence, and I'm not saying it's definitive, but some have adduced evidence to suggest that the Rambam and his family actually converted to Islam under the pain of death, which is halachically allowed, but it's not very pleasant to contemplate. There's no definitive evidence, but it's not impossible. So they wanted to get out of there when they could, and a few years later, the family left Fez, and they arrived in Akko, in the land of Israel. But they didn't stay very long, only about 2 years maybe in the land of Israel. It was under the control of the Crusaders, and the Crusaders and the Muslims were busy murdering one another, and they both hated the Jews. Guess what? So it wasn't a very safe place for the Jews either, and therefore the family moved from the land of Israel to Egypt. And of course in Egypt, that's where the Rambam ultimately settled. And that's what it says in 1165. He settled in Egypt, in Cairo at the age of 30, where he found asylum and religious freedom. Now, what's interesting is that if you keep reading, at age 23, Rambam began writing his commentary on the Mishnah, Perush HaMishnayos, in Arabic. Now, this was also, at the age of 23, he undertook an astonishing project, which was to write a comprehensive commentary on the entire Mishnah. It had never been attempted before. He wrote it in Arabic, and this is published in, it is published in the Standard Mishnayos, which you can find here on the shelf. I can't get it for it, I'm on a leash. But you can find it on the shelf, in the Standard Mishnayos. You can also find it in the Talmud Bavli, the standard editions of the Talmud Bavli. You find it in the back. However, the translation is inconsistent and poor. It was translated by some by the Ibn Tibon, some by others. It's inconsistent. And for that reason, although it is studied and respected, its value as a resource is compromised by the poor translation. And it was translated over the course of many generations as well. I think it was the Rashba who writes in Barcelona in the early 14th century. Someone asked him a question. He said, take a look and see what the Rambam has written on it, because we only have it in Arabic and we don't speak Arabic around here, so we don't know what he says. But if you have access to it, tell us, what does the Rambam say on that passage? So even though now subsequently it was translated in full, but the translation was inconsistent and, as I say, not of the highest quality. About 50 years ago, Rabbi Yosef Kafich undertook a project to translate the Perush HaMishnayos of the Rambam into, I wouldn't say a modern Hebrew, but a more precise Hebrew, and it was published about 50 years ago or so, as this Mishnah in Perush HaRambam, which I have and I've used quite a lot over the years. Again, not as much as I perhaps might have or should have. What's amazing about this is that it was published based on the manuscript, an autographed manuscript, meaning not copied by some scribe, the hand of the Rambam. The actual manuscript that the Rambam wrote was preserved. And it passed into the hands of a man called Solomon Sassoon. He was known as the Rothschilds of India. Very extremely wealthy, philanthropic man, also a scholar, a Talmud Chacham. He moved here to England from India, of Iraqi origins, and he acquired that. I'm not quite sure how, means fair or foul. He acquired it, and he eventually sold it, I think, to the National Library for a lot of money, which he donated to the Sephardic yeshivas in Israel. Wanted to raise money, and he sold it. If he only had held on to it a bit longer, it could have gotten a lot more for it. But anyway, there you have it. It's an autographed manuscript, most extraordinary. And if you want to see an example of the Rambam's artistry, not of the highest caliber, but anyway, you can see it. It's here on page Ayin Tes, where the Rambam has a drawing of the menorah. What did the menorah look like? Did the menorah look like arched branches, or did it look angular? Was it three angular on each side, or was it like this, like a semicircle? And it's difficult to know from the evidence. In fact, it's probably impossible to prove from the evidence, from the written evidence. Of course, the well-known vision is the semicircular ones, which critics say is only based on the Arch of Titus. So why should we trust the Roman sculptor? And the Rambam, in any case, is of the view that it was angular. And here you see on page Ayin Tes, the Rambam's vision, that he doesn't try to do it precisely to scale, just to give you the idea. If you turn the page over, you see another version of it according to the Rambam. Anyway, this is a fascinating work, and he has extensive notes as well.
It's page on the Mishnah.
Yes.
And it was printed before Al-Ka'ab, or that was the first printing?
No, it was printed, but in this poor translation, in the medieval translation, inconsistent. It was translated by different people at different times. So it has been printed for a long time, been widely available, but as I say, the language is difficult. And even today, when I'm learning with my Charus, we want to say, let's see what the Rambam says about it. So we look in the back of the Gemara where the Rambam Perush HaMishnayos is printed, but the language is often quite difficult to understand. This makes it easier.
So when things are printed now, which translation are they using?
They're still using the old one because this is copyright, Mosad Rav Kook. So if you want this, you've got to buy it separately.
That's madness.
Yeah, well...
So why did you write in Arabic in the first place, knowing that think he was, his audience would be mainly...
Yeah, well, that's a good question. In the Rambam's milieu, it was customary to write in that Judeo-Arabic.
Was it early on? It was early, wasn't it?
Yes, so he wrote Perush Hashanais. He started when he was 23 years old. He wrote Mishnah Torah later on. Now, I could say, it's a bit superficial, Daniel, but by way of response to your question, it could be that at first he thought, this is of interest, just to me and my friends or my circle. He wasn't thinking, I'm going to be a star on the world stage, so I need to use a language that scholars in Italy and in Germany and in Yemen will be able to. Well, Yemen they did Judeo-Arabic, but he maybe later on when he thought, well, I need to write something, so to speak, for all time and place. I'm not sure really what, but I think we mentioned in the past that the Jewish writers, the Jewish writers, including the greatest scholars who lived in the Arabic-speaking lands, they wrote in Judeo-Arabic.
Do you think it could have been, if it was early on, maybe it was to get respect from other people that don't understand it, like you said with someone a couple of weeks ago?
Well, I said that when it comes to poetry, they always used Hebrew. But I suppose, as I say, in his milieu, that was the language that was generally used. You could say, yes. Yeah, that's right. Like the Talmud, the Aramaic of the Talmud is difficult. You might say, well, if they're just written in Hebrew, it would make it a little bit easier for all of us. But, they may not have thought in those terms at the time. But it's a very simplistic response. It's a good question to contemplate.
Well, the Talmud, the Aramaic, was that not the spoken language?
It was. Of course, it was a spoken language. So that's why the Rambam wrote this in the spoken language. You could say, Daniel, that if he'd written in Hebrew, it would have been accessible to the scholars worldwide forevermore. But it would have been more difficult for his students. Yeah, that's right. And probably he realized that a more advanced scholar would study the Talmud itself, and maybe the commentary on the Mishnah was for the more the lesser scholar or the beginner, something like that. Possibly.
He was in the job of outreach.
You could say that, yeah, which he probably was. As we'll see a bit more about that as well. Yeah, I think that's probably true to say. Okay, so we can do it is appended to the Vilna edition of the Talmud, and we mentioned that the manuscript of the Rambam himself was in the hands of Solomon Sasson, and you can still view it at the Israel National Library in Jerusalem, in Hebrew University campus. It is appended, right. The work, and when I say you can see it, I don't think you just go and get it from the stacks or something, but I presume if you make special arrangements, it is there, and it's, as I say, one of the greatest treasures because it is in the hand of the Rambam. We'll soon mention another remarkable document as well in the Rambam sphere. The work analyzes each mission, provides an introduction clarifying fundamental tenets of Judaism. Now, this is very interesting. The introductions of the Rambam are a set of works unto themselves. And I've got it here, published as a separate volume, Hakdamot LePerush HaMishnah. This volume, slim volume, because actually it's large print, so it's not that extensive, consists of, I think, 3 Hakdamot. The Hakdamah of the Rambam to the Mishnah, the Hakdamah to Perek Chelek in Sanhedrin, and the Hakdamah to Pirkei Avos, known as Shmona Prakim. The Rambam's introduction to the Mishnah is a fascinating, valuable, important work in its own right. He sets out the transmission of Torah Sheba'al Peh. He sets out the importance of the oral Torah as the essential companion, counterpart to the written Torah, and a very valuable work, very worthwhile for one to study. That's the introduction to the Mishnah. The introduction to Chelek is the philosophical source for the 13 principles of faith of the Rambam, which are written in your Siddur. Many people recite it every morning after Shacharis. Ani Ma'amin Be'emunah Shlema, the 13 principles of faith. Interestingly, we don't know who wrote the 13 principles of faith the way they are formulated in the Siddur, but they are based on what the Rambam writes in his introduction to the 10th chapter of Sanhedrin. What's special about the 10th chapter of Sanhedrin? That is the chapter that begins with the words, all of Israel has a portion in the world to come, except the following people. who don't have a portion in the world to come. So the Rambam explains what philosophical errors could cause a person to forfeit his place in the world to come. And that is a fascinating introduction to Chelek. And then he has what's known as Shmona Prakim, his introduction to Perkei Avos, also a very valuable and fascinating work in its own right. I'll just pass that around as well. So the introduction, yeah.
Well, of course, these 13 principles are themselves highly contentious because up until that point, and he was critiqued for actually stating there were any.
Yeah, that's true. That's true. He was critiqued by some who said that 13 is the wrong number. Some said it should be 613 principles of faith because those are the commandments of the Torah. And anyway, the principles of faith of the Rambam, some of them are not even mitzvot unto themselves in the Torah. And others said, 13 is too many. You can compress it to 7. Some you can compress it to 3. Some have actually said, each one of the 13 we can critique. That you don't have to believe it, some people didn't believe it, and other things like that. Mark Shapiro wrote a book called The Limits of Orthodox Theology on this subject. Maimonides' 13 Principles Reappraised, which is very interesting work in which he seeks to show how, what Tadiani mentioned now, that not everybody classically accepted the whole enterprise of principles of faith. Some people didn't agree with the ones that the Rambam enumerated, and each of the 13, to a certain degree, we can find classic authorities who challenge certain aspects of them as well, which makes fascinating reading if you like that sort of thing. Okay, let's go on because time is nearly up, and I would like to get to some of the selections from the writings of the Rambam here as well. Rambam's philosophical treatise is in the introduction of the tractate Barachot. It's not Brachot, it's Avot. You can just take out your pen and correct that. It's not Brachot, it's Perkei Avot. It's known as Shmona Prakim. It deals with the diseases and cures of man's soul, prophecy, reward and punishment, free will, and the rule of the golden mean. Fascinating and fundamental subjects. In his commentary on Sanhedrin, that's Introduction to Chelek, which we said, the chapter... the 10th chapter of Tractate Sanhedrin, he enunciates the 13 principles of the Jewish faith. Now, let's go back to his biography. When his brother David, who supported the entire family, perished at sea, Rambam began to study medicine and became a physician of note. Now, at this time, Rambam was living in Cairo. By this time, his father had passed away, and the Rambam, was studying. He was studying Torah, studying philosophy. He was versed, I would say he was a master of the intellectual currents of his time. The Greek philosophical tradition had been rendered into Arabic, and the Rambam was clearly not only conversant, but as I said, he was a master of the subject matter, and no doubt he devoted much of his time to studying. How was he able to do that? Why wasn't he compelled to support his family? Didn't have in-laws to look after him. But he did have a brother called David, and he had an arrangement with his brother. He had an arrangement which is based on the Yisachar Zevulun partnership, in which his brother was a merchant, a successful merchant, and his brother supported his own family and the family of the Rambam and the Rambam's family as well. Unfortunately, his brother David perished in the Indian Ocean. And one of the most moving experiences in my studies of the Rambam and the life of the Rambam, I had this past Sukkot when we went to Cambridge University Library, because they had an exhibition of the Cairo Geniza. The story of the Cairo Geniza we have to say for another time, but there one can find manuscripts that, many of which were written by the Rambam. Now some of them are like approbations for fundraisers and Mishulachim and Schnorrers and other people like that. Very kind of down-to-earth sorts of things that the Rambam wrote, a letter of introduction and that kind of thing. But one of the amazing things they have there, which I was able to see with my own eyes, is the letter that David wrote to his brother Moshe from, I forget where he wrote it from, but he traversed the desert. And he said that he had missed the caravan, and he had to take another caravan or something like that. And when he got to the port, he found out that the caravan that he had missed had been set upon by bandits, and they had been robbed, and their merchandise was stolen. Some were killed, I think. So he says, Baruch Hashem, that I had to make my own way because I crossed the desert in safety, and now I'm confident that Hashem will bless the rest of my journey, your brother David. That's the last the Rambam ever heard of from him. His boat apparently sank in the Indian Ocean with the merchandise and everything else. That letter is creased. You can feel as if, and this is pure speculation, but the guide said, one can imagine the Rambam who wrote that he didn't get out of bed for a year. I don't think he's literally didn't get out of bed, but he was so depressed, he was clutching that letter. Again, this is speculation, but you can imagine him reading it and rereading it and holding on to it and crying over it. And that letter is preserved in the Cairo Geniza. It's in Cambridge Library. So he perished at sea, and this compelled the Rambam to support his own family and his brother, his sister-in-law, and children as well. And he became a court physician to the court of Salahuddin. Now, all of the books will tell you that he was a physician to Salahuddin, the famous ruler in Cairo, who ruled over the land of Israel as well. By the way, a relatively benign Muslim ruler. It's questionable whether he was actually the physician to Salahuddin. The dates don't work out quite well enough. It may have been to his successor, but it was the court of Salahuddin in any case.
Can I just say on that, there's actually a book published about Salahuddin recently, and I saw it in Woolstone. I searched for about Maimonides. Very small section, a very limited lines about it. So if it was, it's not considered to be a fundamental element of his life.
No, indeed. I have, in addition to all these books, I also have my Maimonides file here, where I have articles that I've collected over the years, and one of them is Maimonides, Lionheart, and Salahuddin. Because there's a legend that Richard the Lionheart invited Rambam to come to London to be his court physician in London as well. And the Rambam declined and said, no, I'm staying here in Egypt. This is written by Bernard Lewis, one of the great experts in the history of Islamic Muslim lands. And he questions whether there's truth to any of this, actually, including Salahuddin. But it doesn't matter because he was the court physician, but it may have been to the successor of Salahuddin as well. Our time is nearly up, so let's proceed. He used his influence to help his fellow Jews. Now, this text you have in front of you has not been properly edited because the next 10 lines we've already read earlier. It doesn't belong there. So just skip where it says Mishnah Torah. Immediately engaged, going back down to Mishnah Torah subject, immediately gained immense popularity. It became the most authoritative text on halakha, and over 325 commentaries were written on it. Over the centuries, no novella was written, no Talmudic discourse was given without discussion of the relevant rulings in Mishnah Torah. Rambam Sefer Mitzvahs, written in Arabic, enumerates and elucidates the 613 precepts of the Torah. By the way, the Sefer Mitzvahs of the Rambam has a number of extensive commentaries, of which maybe the most interesting is that of the Ramban. Maimonides, who we'll discuss next week, wrote a commentary and a critique of the Sefer Mitzvahs of the Rambam, in which he criticizes the Rambam in a number of different ways. And in some regards, he says the Rambam has left out some commandments of his list, and he's put in some other ones which don't belong. So the Ramban also studied very closely, I would say with a fine-tooth comb, the Sefer HaMitzvahs of the Rambam. Most authoritative and expert translators in all of medieval Jewish life. They translated from Arabic into Hebrew. Shmuel ibn Tibon, Yehuda ibn Tibon, and other members of the family translated many classical philosophical works written in Judeo-Arabic by great Torah personalities, including some that you may have heard of, some you may not have heard of, and they translated them into Hebrew, and their translations were generally of a very good quality. Yehuda al-Kharizi was not as expert. He was a poet. He was probably not as learned, and it was his translation of Moreh Nevuchim that was more widely available to Ramban and many others. And because his translation is not as precise and not as reliable, that sometimes has fed into some of the misunderstanding about the Moreh Nevuchim. But that's probably just a minor factor. The main reason it was so controversial because of what it says. Because many of and the whole orientation of Moreh Nevuchim, which let's finish reading here, then I'll tell you a little bit more about it, and then we'll look briefly at some of the selections. It addresses the persons who were baffled by seeming contradictions between the teachings of the Torah and Aristotelian philosophy. Rambam demonstrates that there is no conflict between the two if the fundamentals of both are properly understood and interpreted. Now, that is a very good sentence, because the Rambam is absolutely certain that there can be no contradiction between two things which are true. If I say something which is true and I say something else which is true, they cannot be contradicting one another. It's impossible. It's logically impossible. What could be the case, though, is that they seem to contradict because the reader might not understand the truth of one statement or the other statement, or he may not understand the truth of either statement. In other words, the interpretation and the depth of those statements must be properly understood in order to realize that there is no conflict between them. The question, of course, is which one are you going to reinterpret? So many scholars, and certainly in the Kabbalistic tradition, they said, you're making yourself crazy of reconciling Aristotle and the Torah. Forget Aristotle. He's a heathen. He's a Greek. Why do you pay him any heed? Just leave him alone. Let's see what the traditional understanding of the Torah is and go with that. We don't need anything more. The Rambam didn't take that view. The Rambam was convinced that our rational faculty must be applied to the Torah, that Aristotle, he regarded Aristotle as achieving a level not much below that of the prophets, and he was a faithful follower or advocate of Aristotle. There were certain examples where the Rambam would say that Aristotle's position is either not well understood or difficult to understand, or maybe Aristotle has no proof to his view. So where our tradition and Aristotelian philosophy are in absolute conflict, so then the Rambam would say that Aristotle's sort of evidence is lacking, etc. We don't have time to go into the philosophical complexities of it, but it is true to say the Rambam sought to reconcile them. What is an error, though, is to say that Moreh Nevuchim was written for philosophers who lost their faith. It's not so. Moreh Nevuchim was written for religious people who did not understand philosophy as well as they should. The Rambam, as I said, was an advocate of philosophy. He didn't just feel that we can reconcile the Torah with philosophy. He went much further. He embraced philosophy, the Greek philosophical tradition. Now, he critiqued it, but he fundamentally believed that Aristotle was describing reality as it truly is. And therefore, and he felt that religion that is lacking in philosophical sophistication is anemic, is superficial, and is only suitable for women and children. I don't mean to be politically incorrect, but that's what he writes. He dedicated Moreh Nevuchim to his favorite Talmud, Yosef ben Yehuda ibn Aknin. This was his leading Talmud, and he dedicated Moreh Nevuchim to him. It wasn't for philosophers who lost their faith. It was for rabbis who didn't know about philosophy. Now, it's true that along the way, he does reconcile and he does address some of these difficulties. Our time is pretty much up, so I'm just going to pass these around. This is the classic English translation by someone called Leo Strauss, University of Chicago. It's an enormous tome, as you can see, very turgid, hard to read. This one is even more turgid and even more hard to read, written by someone here in London called Friedlander of Jews College. I think his son was the rabbi at Westminster Reform Synagogue, I'm sorry to say. Anyway, he translated it into English 100+ years ago, and the one from University of Chicago is better, it's more recent. This is the classic Moreh Nevuchim with the commentaries. This was probably printed, I don't know, maybe 50 years ago, but it was originally printed maybe 100 years ago. It's actually quite a nice print with a number of important commentaries, medieval classic commentaries, Moreh Nevuchim in Hebrew. And finally, this one is also Yosef Kafach, the same Yemenite scholar who translated Moreh Nevuchim again from the original Arabic into Hebrew. Again, it's probably a more reliable translation, more expert translation, and he has some notes as well. still quite difficult. You may laugh, I once thought I'm going to use this as bedtime reading. It didn't go that well. I tried this, I tried that one as well. I did try, but I had to give it up. It's not the right sort of context to be studying. The Rambam would probably consider it an insult even, so maybe that's another reason to give it up. Okay, I just want to mention the objections to Moreh Nevuchim and objections to the Rambam. So he was assailed by many. The Raavad criticized his halachic judgment, but others went much further and criticized him personally and condemned him. And I have here it's not an article, it's a off-print of a very long and fascinating responsum by someone called Mahram al-Ashkar. He was a scholar who lived in, I think he lived in Egypt most of the time, but I've got my notes here. He was born in Spain in 1465. He died in Jerusalem in 1541. I think he lived in Egypt a lot in between. In any case, he has a very respected collection of responsa, cited in the halachic literature. Just today I was learning with my chavrusa something from the Chuvas Mahram al-Ashkar, but the reason I've got it in my hands right now is he has a long responsum in which he reacts to the writings of a book called Sefer HaEmunot by Shem Tov ben Yosef ibn Shem Tov. Now, who was this Ibn Shem Tov guy? So there was a Kabbalist I forget which way it was. A philosopher who wrote a commentary on Moreh Nevuchim. It's in that one going around, on a commentary on Moreh Nevuchim called Shem Tov. His, I think, son became a Kabbalist and rejected the writings of the Rambam and condemned the Rambam. And he writes things like the author of this is a heretic, and he said, I think you should, not read it. You should burn his writings, etc., and that sort of thing. So this, I don't want to pass it around, but I once studied it in detail. Just you can leaf through it. You can see it's a long scholarly treatise in which the author, defends the Rambam from the condemnation of Shem Tov ben Yosef ibn Shem Tov, who I believe was the Kabbalist, the son of the philosopher. The reason I belabor the point is to go back to where we began, and this was a comment that Yosef suggested, that the Rambam did not have access to the Kabbalistic tradition, and therefore he didn't know about it, he didn't understand it, and if he had known, perhaps he would have taken it into account. And one of the other learned people, I think it was Daniel, said, yeah, but the Rambam's orientation was in opposition to the Kabbalists. And there's truth to that as well, because as I say, the Kabbalists rejected the Rambam, and it's likely that the Rambam would have rejected the Kabbalists. Yes.
He said the only way to learn Kabbalah is to learn.
Oh, is that right? I see. Okay. You mean Avram Abulafia? Okay. Yeah, he was a very maverick personality as well. Okay, let's just wrap it up. His supremacy as a scholar is best expressed in the famous dictum inscribed on his tomb, "From Moshe ad Moshe lo kam kemoshe." From Moshe Rabbeinu until Moshe ben Maimon lo kam kemoshe. There was no one else like him. I'm afraid we didn't have time to go through the excerpts. Yeah, it's inscribed on the tomb of the Rambam. Who's buried in Tiberia, so it would seem.
There's one museum there as well.
When did he write today?
Yes, when did he?
Who wrote the inscription?
I'm not sure. Much later.
Probably himself.
No, no, he wasn't that arrogant.
For your settlement from Rashi to Rashi, there will be no.
Okay, thank you very much. And so please take it with you and look at the excerpts. We didn't have time for them, but I guess it was always too ambitious to think we could get through 4 pages of text today. But thank you for your patience. And we do have time for mincha, if we do have a minute. Yeah.
On the way.
Yeah, on the way. Okay.
We have 3 on the way.
Okay, good. Good. Thank you.